Hello, friends. My name is JJ, and I apologize if this sounds like something out of 2018, but today we are going to dunk on PragerU. Let me explain. As you might have heard, President Trump recently installed this preposterous Hall of Presidents by the former White House Rose Garden, featuring little plaques with little condensed biographies of all of the presidents, several of which he wrote himself. And these got a lot of attention just because of how nakedly partisan and stupid they are. I actually transcribed a bunch of them for posterity because they are really, truly something to behold. For example, President Biden's little biography begins,
"Sleepy Joe Biden was by far the worst president in American history, taking office as a result of the most corrupt election ever seen in the United States. Biden oversaw a series of unprecedented disasters that brought our nation to the brink of destruction."
Obama's biography, by contrast, ends with,
"Obama spied on the 2016 presidential campaign of Donald J. Trump and presided over the creation of the Russia hoax, the worst political scandal in American history."
Several of the biographies of the older presidents include even more strained and gratuitous references to Trump. Take Andrew Jackson's, for instance, which says,
"Jackson was unjustifiably treated unfairly by the press, but not as viciously and unfairly as President Abraham Lincoln and President Donald J. Trump would in the future be."
So yes, a completely absurd and childish spectacle. But what does this have to do with PragerU, you ask? Well, you see, even though Trump did clearly write large portions of the mini biographies of the recent presidents, a lot of the biographies of the older presidents that Trump didn't really care about were clearly just pulled from some pre-existing source. Like, here is part of the biography of James Buchanan, for instance, which doesn't sound like Trump at all.
James Old Buck Buchanan was a lawyer, diplomat, and career politician who served as a member of Congress, U.S. Senator, and Secretary of State, playing a key role in seminal events, including the Mexican-American War and Oregon boundary settlement. As president, he contended with the Panic of 1857, a financial crisis that greatly affected the entire nation.
And this got me wondering if maybe the text for these plaques had come from PragerU, which, as I'm sure you know, is a company that bills itself as America's leading conservative educational resource for civics and history. They sell all sorts of books and posters and things, and have a popular YouTube channel that a lot of left-wing YouTubers really like to crap on. The Trump administration is known for being close to PragerU, so I thought it was plausible to assume that some of the more boring presidential biographies on the plaques had just been copy and pasted from some PragerU guide to the presidents or something. So with this theory in mind, I ordered this, the PragerU Honest Book of Presidents, published in 2025. And I'm sorry to say that my thesis was wrong. I did not, in fact, solve the mystery of who wrote the presidential plaques, but I do now have the experience of reading through this thing, and it is quite a fascinating object in its own right. So I'm not as close-minded as some when it comes to PragerU in theory. I think there is indeed a crisis these days of young people not getting a sufficient civics and history education, and I like that PragerU pumps so much money into producing all of these lovely-looking educational materials for children and teens. And I even kind of agree with them that some of the widespread ignorance we see among the kids these days is at least partially the result of too many teachers and textbook writers being too woke or left-wing, especially when it comes to things like the history of the presidents. I think that being too quick to judge historical figures by the standards of our own time, rather than the less enlightened times that they lived, is a problem that can lead to historical illiteracy when it becomes the dominant theme of what is being taught. So in theory, I like what this book is promising to deliver. Let me read you a bit from the introduction, written by PragerU Executive Director Alan Estrin. This book is both factual and contextual. That is, our authors explain the chief executives in the context of the era in which they lived. That's why we call it the Honest Book of Presidents. Our authors don't whitewash the truth, but they also don't paint it all black either. Above all, they try to be fair. A worthy goal, but does it meet its own standards? Or is it just right-wing slop? Let us do a review. So first, let me tell you a bit about the basic structure of the Honest Book of Presidents. It is described as being written for kids in grade 9 and above, and appropriate for both classrooms and families. Each president gets his own brief 2,000-word chapter, sometimes 2 chapters if the president is considered especially important. These chapters are all written by different people, mostly PragerU board members and pundits, or, as they are rather grandly described by the book itself, some of the most distinguished historians and thinkers in America. In fact, if I was to offer one early criticism of the book, it would be the excessive flattery its contributors are given. At the end of every presidential biography is a rather long biography of the writer themselves, often close to 200 words documenting every degree they have and every book they've written and all the various TV stations they've appeared on. This reminds me of that old joke about how the number of words on your business card correlates with how unimportant you are. But in any case, how is the quality of their writing? So there's kind of a big gap between how the authors write about the early presidents versus how they write about the more recent ones. Overall, most of the early presidents are characterized as being basically impressive and interesting people. If I had to summarize the writing style, I would say it is basically middle-aged people trying to make presidents seem exciting to 14-year-old boys. They tend to devote a lot of their 2,000 words to the president's pre-presidential or even pre-political lives. For example, talking about cool or interesting things they did when they were young. The biography of George Washington, for instance, barely even talks about his presidency at all, and instead focuses on his gallantry as a soldier and general. Although military command was completely new to him, Washington already displayed the intangibles of leadership, decisiveness, the ability to stay calm under pressure, and physical courage. He endured extreme hardships without complaint, facing near-death experiences without flinching. Almost freezing to death and nearly drowning in an icy river were only 2 examples. And I don't think this is bad. I mean, I personally prefer my history to be a little bit less flowery and romantic, but I get the motivation. They want to tell a version of American history that really draws you in. The book puts particular effort into trying to make the traditionally obscure presidents sound interesting and important, and I think they do a pretty good job of this. I particularly enjoyed the biography of Chester A. Arthur, which was written by Michael Knowles, of all people, and I think it does a good job of making him seem like a consequential and admirable guy. In one of the least expected and most remarkable turnabouts in presidential history, the quintessential machine politician, a man who once bragged about vote buying, became the president who enacted the most sweeping civil service reform in 50 years. Much to the chagrin of his friends, he became an apostle of clean government and set the tone for future reforms that occurred after he left office. This kind of thing reveals one of the more interesting biases of the book, just the degree that it plays into a certain cult of the presidency understanding of American patriotism. The book clearly believes that the vast majority of American presidents were basically good people who did good things, and that American kids should know and appreciate this. All of the early biographies really stress this idea that most presidents meant well and were doing what they thought was right in the context of their times. Contrary to what some on the left might expect, the biographies do not shy away from acknowledging that many of the presidents were slaveholders or were bad to the Indians and things like that. They just try to portray those things in a context where what was being done was informed by a certain logic that might not have aged well. Here is a typical passage from the biography of Rutherford B. Hayes, the president who notoriously ended Reconstruction after the Civil War. Should Hayes be blamed for the unsatisfactory results of Reconstruction and the subsequent rise of racist Jim Crow laws? He frequently is, but should he be? The country wanted to put the war behind it. There was little popular will for the occupation to continue, and it's doubtful that Congress would have consented to keeping federal troops in the South for much longer, no matter who was president. Prior to the 20th century, the only presidents who are portrayed as being decisively bad are probably Taylor, Pierce, Buchanan, and Johnson. A lot are portrayed as being controversial, but more good than bad, with the bad parts forgivable. I think it's interesting to imagine what a book that continued this approach right up to the present day would be like. You know, treating every US president as essentially a well-meaning and impressive person. But alas, the PragerU book does not do this, because ultimately PragerU is part of a 21st century partisan political project, and at some point it becomes necessary to start portraying America's presidents as either heroes or villains in a way that validates modern-day Republican narratives and thereby encourages readers to like the Republican Party. I would say it is the biography of William Howard Taft when things start to get noticeably biased in a more pointedly ideological direction, as opposed to just the direction of making you love everyone. Taft is portrayed as a good guy, a sensible, moderate conservative worried by the rise of unrestrained progressivism in the US, which he sees as tyrannical and unconstitutional. He worries about this sort of impulse in his mentor, former President Teddy Roosevelt, who leaves the Republican Party to run against Taft as a third-party progressive candidate in the 1912 election alongside the Democrat candidate Woodrow Wilson. The election is characterized thusly. Roosevelt and Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson campaigned as progressives, seeking to fundamentally change the American political system. Taft steered a more traditional course. Unfortunately, his campaign theme, defending the Constitution, excited few voters at a time when progressivism was all the rage. And I would say this is the first time in the book when presidential elections start to be framed not as a worthy battle between two candidates with distinct but basically honorable agendas, but rather a more Manichaean split between the forces of right and wrong. Woodrow Wilson, who beats Taft, is accordingly portrayed as a scheming character, a pompous Ivy League academic seduced by fashionable theories that reject traditional American values of individual freedom in favor of bossy, know-it-all government. As president, he is cast as a sort of petty tyrant imposing what is repeatedly referred to as a fundamental transformation of America. Wilson's program marked the arrival of the idea that government was not merely the servant of the people, but its savior. Ironically, he entitled his program The New Freedom. Woodrow Wilson is no doubt a complex and flawed president, but what is telling about this biography is that it marks the first point in the book when any pretense of nuance or fairness starts to be abandoned. It does not acknowledge, for example, that Wilson was very popular in his own time, and for a while was even considered one of America's canonically greatest presidents by a fairly broad bipartisan consensus. I mean, they didn't put him on the $100,000 bill for nothing. David Frum wrote a good piece about Wilson in The Atlantic a while ago that I think actually does meet the criteria of a fair assessment of a controversial president by the standards of his own time. And importantly, he also discusses how conservatives in recent years have made a conscious effort to cast Wilson as one of the greatest villains in American history, largely because he was a champion of the idea that well-designed public programs could help drive positive social reform, or as the title of his chapter in the PragerU book calls him, the founder of big government. As David Frum writes, Wilson was one of the first American scholars to study the emerging administrative state, and conservatives imagine that if they can discredit him, they can discredit it as well. Over the last few years, theatrically hating Woodrow Wilson has become a very fashionable thing to do, and people might be right or wrong to do it. But the point is, conservatives like to hate him for very particular ideological reasons, and in the book's treatment of him, you see for the first time the need to make a Democrat president look bad take precedent over what the introduction promised, trying to be fair. That spirit of fairness, however, does abruptly return with the three Republican presidents of the 1920s, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, who are all portrayed, once again, as well-meaning and mostly successful, but with their virtues now being cast in a more ideological light. They're all explicitly praised for being champions of small and restrained government, which is credited for fostering the strength of the American economy during the 1920s, when taxes and regulations on business were low. In fairness to PragerU, I could say that these presidents did indeed believe these things, and praising them for it would be consistent with the book's general theme of giving the benefit of the doubt to whatever presidents believed to be true at the time. But even then, it's a little bit much to call Harding's chapter the least appreciated president, and Coolidge's chapter the best president you don't know. As the issues that the presidents are forced to deal with start to become more identifiably modern, the book takes a more stridently propagandistic tone, encouraging the reader to correlate certain contemporary conservative ideas, like small government, with being good, and ideas of the contemporary left, like progressive reform and activist government, as being bad. FDR is portrayed as basically a failure, with his New Deal programs to battle the Great Depression cast as a lot of big government nonsense that actually made the crisis worse, as the final sentences of his first chapter assert. We can praise President Roosevelt's war service all we like, but there's no way around that New Deal record. President Franklin Roosevelt himself put the great in Great Depression. Roosevelt's war service, in turn, is rather tediously portrayed entirely through the prism of big business's contribution to the production of weapons during World War II. This is cast as evidence that Roosevelt was only really successful when he resisted his big government impulses. Or, as it says in the closing line of his second chapter, all this was made possible because the president learned from his past mistakes and had the courage to meet a new situation with a new idea. His closest advisors wanted him to put all of his chips on government control, but he chose to bet the future of freedom on American capitalism instead. Truman, Eisenhower, and JFK are again treated fairly and sympathetically, mostly on their own terms, which I guess reflects how they were mostly centrist characters who are hard to fit into a modern left-right framing. By the time we get to Lyndon Johnson, however, we have really entered the realm of pure partisan propaganda. Like Roosevelt, Johnson is portrayed as pushing a lot of expensive big government programs that just waste a lot of money and don't really do anything. Like Wilson, he is cast as someone who wanted to fundamentally change America simply out of his own sense of vanity and self-importance. Here is the last passage of the first Johnson chapter, which deals with domestic policy. We hear all of the time that the Great Society was a great success. Perhaps that's because romanticizing government intervention is a rule in public radio and television, both institutions made possible through a 1967 law signed by Johnson. Today might be the moment to clear our heads and the moment to take the Great Society record seriously. Yes, we are living in Lyndon Johnson's America, but that doesn't mean we have to. Nixon, by contrast, is given a glowing review by famed conservative pundit Hugh Hewitt, who describes him as America's most misunderstood and underappreciated president. Bad news for Warren Harding, I suppose. At this point, the biographies are starting to sprinkle in hackish phrases like liberal elites while sneering at the media in this contemptuous way. I will say that Carter's biography is surprisingly generous and even concedes him some impressive achievements, though still portrays him as a failure overall. And this is interesting because for most other presidents who have a reputation for being ineffective, like Hoover or Nixon or Harding or the Bushes, the book goes out of its way to suggest that actually they were very successful and we shouldn't be so quick to swallow all of the overly critical conventional wisdom about them. Which again is fair enough if the book aspires to be fundamentally uplifting and celebratory across the board. But at this point in the book, conventional wisdom is only portrayed as being wrong when it is too critical of Republicans or too complimentary of Democrats. If a Republican is generally considered to be good in the broad cultural imagination, like Ronald Reagan, then his goodness is aggressively affirmed, as Governor Scott Walker does in his biography of Reagan, where he calls him the man who resurrected and redefined America. But the popularity of somebody like Bill Clinton is undermined by calling him the luckiest president in US history for presiding over an era of peace and prosperity, and ultimately concludes that he was a disappointment because although much was accomplished, so much more could have been done. The biographies of the last three presidents, however, just completely descend into Breitbart-style slop. Obama's biography, written by a rather infamous PragerU contributor named Carol Swain casts him as an impatient egomaniac who inflamed racial tensions, tried to destroy the US healthcare system for no real reason, and unleashed chaos on the Middle East through his Iran nuclear deal. The book is very big into this idea that one of the worst things a Democrat can do is to seek to transform America, which is synonymous with being unpatriotic, unless, I guess, Ronald Reagan does it. So this is another bad thing that Obama is repeatedly accused of doing, wanting to fundamentally transform the US. Or how about this line, which appears early in his biography, after describing his historic victory as the first black president? "We would later learn that the man whose triumph testified to America's greatness rejected America's greatness." And I mean, I really just don't know if that's the most fair and honest summary you could give to Barack Obama in the context of a book that also calls Richard Nixon America's most misunderstood president. I'm always very interested in how Trump, who I think by any definition is obviously the weirdest president in American history, can be presented as basically normal in the context of things like textbooks for ninth graders. I made a whole other video where I discuss this in some detail. In the context of this book, the Trump chapter, which is written by Neil Ferguson, portrays Trump as being basically successful on the policy front and only controversial to the extent that he is forced to endure constant unfair attacks from Democrats. Let me just read you this extended passage on the 2020 election, because I think it very clearly illustrates what I'm talking about. So it's just finished describing George Floyd's death. Orchestrated by the group Black Lives Matter and fanned by Democrats and the media, protests and riots erupted across the country. It was in this feverish atmosphere that the 2020 election campaign took place. The Democrats insisted on mail-in balloting, ostensibly to avoid spreading the coronavirus. In many states, they got their way. Unwisely, Trump discouraged Republicans from casting postal votes. Despite spending most of the race in the basement of his Delaware home, the Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, won 81 million votes, 15 million more than Barack Obama had in 2012 to Trump's 74 million. Trump was convinced the election had been stolen. On January 6, 2021, he encouraged a large crowd to march to the Capitol. Partially because of woefully inadequate policing, the protest ran out of control. In the aftermath, the Democrats again impeached Trump. When this failed, they unleashed a barrage of criminal and civil cases against him. Biden, meanwhile, whose chapter is given the ominous title of Decline and Fall, is bluntly described as being incapable of doing the job. Biden's old age might have been forgiven if, as promised, he'd unified the nation by governing as a sensible moderate. Instead, he further divided it by moving far to the left. This is another framing the book really likes. If a Republican is known to be controversial, the book says it is because Democrats or the media didn't like him. If a Democrat is controversial, however, this is just taken to be a logical consequence of the objectively bad things he did. More than any other president in this entire book, Biden is portrayed as a man with basically no redeeming qualities, whose presidency was just a complete and abject failure on every conceivable level. If this was your only source of information about the US presidents, I think you would very clearly walk away agreeing with the conclusion of the Trump auto pen plaque that Sleepy Joe was indeed the worst president in American history. This is also, incidentally, the conclusion of a supplementary survey that PragerU did on the presidents as part of a larger promotional campaign for the book. They asked 155 conservative big shots to rank the presidents, and in the average ranking that followed, Joe Biden was placed dead last. Even worse than such villains as Carter, Obama, and Wilson. Trump, incidentally, was not ranked on the grounds that his tenure as president is ongoing, which I guess is fair enough. So here are my final thoughts on this book, which I do not think is very good, and I would not recommend you buy for the ninth grader in your life. I think if you have a problem with mainstream educational materials being too biased, the best way to counter that is to create things that aspire to be more objective, not to simply be more biased in some other direction. That is a very simple and obvious conclusion, but I think it's still true. I think that young people are often very interested in learning about controversial things, and I'm a big fan of the teach the controversy school of thought when it comes to contentious topics like politicians. Unless one half of a debate is occurring like completely outside of the bounds of factual reality, a mature approach to teaching controversial topics should entail saying, well, some people think this, and some people think that, and there are understandable reasons why they might disagree. I think that's what being a fair and honest educator truly entails, because life is in fact messy and politics is a business of endless disagreement and argument. There are many chapters of this book that do meet this standard, where they do indeed teach the controversy and encourage a nuanced understanding. But ultimately, PragerU just couldn't make a book that saw that task through to completion, because in the end, the goal of PragerU is not to impart fact-based knowledge for its own sake, but rather to push partisan propaganda designed to steer American kids towards liking the Republican Party. And that, ultimately, is the kind of corrupt goal that is incompatible with any honest attempt at anything. If you would like to learn more about the PragerU presidential biographies, their YouTube channel has conveniently made videos in which the essays from the book are read aloud by the original authors. And for younger viewers, you may be excited to know that if you are considering enrolling at Southeastern University, Central Florida's leading Christ-centered mid-sized regional college, you can also use watching or reading the PragerU Guide to the Presidents for course credit. No Christian college is giving any course credit for watching my videos. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week.